Secretary Madeleine Albright, thanks so much for joining us. Congratulations on the award, and it's an honor to have you with us.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm so grateful for the award. So thank you very, very much.
I want to ask you about first about something that you wrote in your book, Hell and Other Destinations, your 21st century memoir, because you've already published your 20th century memoirs. And it's a story about your granddaughter's confusion about why the big fuss over Grandma having been Secretary of State. What did she say?
Well, it's interesting because she literally said, "So what's the big deal about Grandma Maddy being Secretary of State?" And it was at the time that she had seen Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton, so it didn't seem like such a big deal. But I did try to explain to her that I was the first woman Secretary of State of the United States in, at that time, 200 years, so, or more than 200 years. So it was a pretty big deal. I'm not sure how much it earned me more respect with my youngest granddaughter, but it is, for me, one of the truly great honors to even think about being a footnote in American history.
It's a reminder that that you broke a big glass ceiling, and you were of a generation that was doing a lot of that. How different is the working world today for, say, a newly minted Wellesley graduate than it was for you and your classmates way back in the 20th century?
I have to tell you, it is so different. And I often say that I went to college sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. So it really was very different. And one of the things, even though Wellesley is a women's college and we had all the leadership roles and everything, one of the things that we all remember is that our commencement speaker, who at that stage had been was Secretary of Neil McElroy, who was Secretary of Defense because his daughter was in our class, basically said to us, "Your main responsibility is to get married and raise children." And the fact that we didn't walk out is kind of stunning in itself. I had wanted to be a journalist, and I was one of the editors of my paper and married a journalist. And when I was having dinner with his managing editor, he looked at me and he said, "So what are you going to do, honey?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to work on a newspaper." And he said, "I don't think so. You can't work on the same paper as your husband because of labor regulations." And even though there were 3 other papers in Chicago at the time, he said, "And you don't want to compete with your husband, so go find something else to do." And I basically saluted and did. And so it was quite different.
This was conventional wisdom for the
very much
the
so,
time
yes.
which you were hearing. Well, you did, as Secretary of State, you did something that I don't think any male Secretary of State had ever done, which is you became famous for your jewelry, for your pins, which you were always seen wearing a pin, and you actually published a coffee table-sized book about your pins, and they have special meaning. So, what is the meaning of the pin you're wearing today?
Well, first, let me tell you why this all happened is because when I was at the United Nations, it was I was an instructed ambassador, and my instructions was right after the Gulf War, and the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions, and my instructions were to make sure the sanctions stayed on. So I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein every day. He deserved it. He invaded Kuwait. And so all of a sudden a poem appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. So I had a snake pin. And I started wearing that whenever we talked about Iraq. And then the other ambassadors I thought, this is fun. I was asked about it, and I was living in New York and could go buy a lot of costume jewelry. And I wore whatever I thought we were going to do on any given day, which were, flowers and butterflies on good days, and carnivorous animals and spiders and things on bad days. And the other ambassadors would say, "What are we going to do today?" And I'd say, "Read my pin." So that is how it started. So this particular pin does have a real significance. And it also has something to do with the last book, Hell and Other Destinations, which is I describe what it was like to be in England during World War II, during the Blitz. And my father was there with the Czechoslovak government in exile. And his job was to broadcast into Czechoslovakia through BBC. And so I was little, I thought he actually was in the radio, but I listened to BBC. And every BBC broadcast began with a kettle drum sound of the first notes of Beethoven's Fifth, da-da-da-dum, V for victory in Morse code. And so I was wearing it when I talk about the book, and it's something that I believe in. And so I like wearing a V for victory.
I want to ask you about the book you wrote before this one, which is a very interesting book called Fascism, A Warning, which I guess you were inspired to write in part because your life has been shaped by your family's encounter with fascism, Hitler's invasion of your native Czechoslovakia, later Stalin's domination of the country. Also, the proliferation of authoritarian dictators around the world, and also the liberal use of the word fascism in the Trump era. So you would say, you would not call Donald Trump a fascist. What do you make of him? How do you describe this phenomenon of the past 4 years?
Well, I think that first of all, on fascism, it's a term people just throw around without fully understanding what it means. It's not an ideology. It is a process for gaining power. And I decided that I wanted to write about it to try to understand where it came from, why it had taken hold initially with Mussolini. He was the first fascist, and then with Hitler. And then I wanted to see what was going on contemporaneously. And so I write about the things that trouble me so deeply in Hungary, and some in Poland and in the Philippines. And I was worried about things that were happening in the United States. And part of what is fascism basically is gaining power by having a leader who identifies with one group at the expense of another, which then really becomes the scapegoat for everything, and the division, and exacerbates divisions which already exist. And so, for instance, Mussolini, the Italians felt that they had not been really respected enough for the role that they'd played by fighting with the Allies at the end of World War I. And there were economic divisions. And all of a sudden, Mussolini, who was a good speaker and a demagogue, began dividing the society in a way to really create the kinds of problems that he then took advantage of even more. But a fascist is somebody who does this identification with one group, has no respect for the law, thinks he's above the law, thinks that the enemy is the press of that the press is the enemy of the people, and basically that the rules are just made for him to break. And so I did think and do think it was important to describe what it is. I do think that there are certainly, when Trump himself, I think he's the least democratic president in American history. And I actually would not call him a fascist because I think he'd like it. He would be identified with some of the people that he has admired. And by the way, Mussolini thought he was a stable genius, did say drain the swamp in Italian. And the best quote in that book comes from Mussolini, which is that if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. And so I think there has been an awful lot of feather plucking, and the chicken's pretty bald at this point.
You wrote this about fascism. I was very much struck by it. Fascism, you wrote, draws energy from men and women who are upset because of a lost war, a lost job, a memory of humiliation, or a sense that their country is in steep decline. The more painful the grounds for resentment, the easier it is for a fascist leader to gain followers by dangling the prospect of renewal or by vowing to take back what's been stolen. We don't live in a fascist country, but we have a lot of fellow countrymen who feel a sense of having been wronged, having lost what they had, possibly a job, possibly an industry. How do you think we go about healing that sentiment, or at least addressing it, without making promises that nobody can actually make good on?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the stunning part for all of us is that somehow we ignored some of these things, because this is not something that happened overnight in the United States. And I think that Trump took advantage of it and exacerbated the divisions. I do think, and when I was going around with that book, I had my to-do list. My to-do list was to call out the things that I'd already mentioned to you, but also to make a point of talking to people with whom you disagree, not kind of tolerate them, but to respect where they're coming from and why they feel the way they do. And I think that they need to be made part of the solution in terms of how we deal with these issues, recognizing that they are not just objects of what policy is, but that they are the subjects of it, that we can all work together. And I think we do need to recognize that it's going to take time, and that, and it's no secret who I think should be the next president, is somebody who believes in unifying the people and not doing more to divide them, and therefore listening. I think Vice President Biden is a really good listener, and so will the people that are around him. They will be, and I think that that's what we need to do, but not expect, frankly, miracles overnight. That this is going to take time. It took time happening, and it's going to take time to change to understand better and to try to rectify some of the divisions that have been exacerbated.
You're right about something that happened at the very end of your term as Secretary of State, when President Bill Clinton, your boss, got deeply involved in what was his last-ditch effort to achieve an Arab-Israeli peace, an Israeli-Palestinian peace between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. I think you wanted him to get more involved in North Korea at that moment, and you say, at the end, he said, you were right, because if I'd known, if I'd known that I couldn't trust Arafat, I think is what you quote him saying, I wouldn't have gotten involved with it. If a new Secretary of State were to ask you, is the pursuit of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement worth the political capital, or is it a lost cause or a case for the back burner, what would you tell her?
Well, let me say the following thing. We spent an incredible amount of time on Israeli-Palestinian issues. And by the way, it is the anniversary of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, and what an incredible difference his death really made in the whole issue. Every assassination is bad, but his extremely. And President Clinton was dedicated to doing something to bring peace, and we did spend an awful lot of time. I can tell many stories about that, but I also, not to make my, I'm not saying that it was not important even at the time it came up, but the bottom line is that we had a chance to do something about North Korea, which I can talk about in a minute, and that we had done so much on the Middle East, and that we had just spent time at Camp David, that we had made a lot of efforts to keep going with a lot of the issues. I did in Paris, and President Clinton went on. We were doing the Clinton parameters, and it was just one of those terrible choices in terms of priorities. I do think that it is important to spend time on the Middle East peace process. The thing that I find interesting, by the way, is how it is not central to the problems that are going on in the Middle East at the moment, which just goes to show how complicated the issues are in the Middle East. By the way, I worked for a president who read a lot, and he assigned books to, and one that President Clinton assigned to me was called The Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, an American historian, which talks about the creation of the modern Middle East after the end of World War I and the complexity of the countries that came into existence. By the way, the short version of the book is the modern Middle East came into existence because, or the way it did was when the British and French bureaucracies were lying to each other. But yes. I think that the complexities of it now, and then the lack of political leadership or interest in it in Israel, as well as among the Palestinians. And so it is an issue that has to be dealt with. I believe in a two-state solution, but I also think it is now has been kind of dismissed, and it shouldn't be dismissed, but we have to deal with all the things that are going on in the Middle East. There's going to be a very, very large agenda for the next Secretary of State and the President and Vice President.
I want to ask you about a personal matter, about the Jewish thing. You're learning well into adulthood that not only were your parents, your grandparents, at least born Jewish, but three of them died at the hands of the Nazis. It's been now more than a couple of decades since this was news, and you do write that you were hurt by some Jewish friends who were skeptical of your saying you hadn't known this. Now that you've had a long time to digest that strange development in your life, how did it affect you? What if anything is different in our conversations, say, for your having learned deep into your professional life at the peak of success that your parents had kept a secret from you about their origins?
I'm glad you asked that, because it's a complex, just the circumstances of it. When I became ambassador to the UN, all of a sudden my name was in the papers a lot, and I started getting letters from people, mostly from what was Czechoslovakia at that time, where the dates were wrong. Somebody said they knew my father when they were in high school in 1915, which would have been impossible since my father was born in 1909. And the names of the villages were wrong, and then they said I need a visa or I need money. So I kind of didn't pay much attention to them. A couple of them said something like, "And we knew your family to be Jewish." So what happened was my name comes up to be Secretary of State, and all of a sudden I get a letter from somebody that has all the names of the villages and the dates right, and I'm being vetted to be Secretary of State. And the lawyer at the White House, they asked the normal question about taxes and nannies and things, and so then they said, "We ask everybody this last question: is there anything that you didn't tell us about yourself that we should know?" And I said, "Well, look, I just got this letter, and it's perfectly possible that I'm of Jewish background." And the lawyer said, "So what? The president is not anti-Semitic." So then what happened is, as you know, you're not supposed to talk to the press between the time that you're named and the time you're confirmed. But Michael Dobbs from the Washington Post wanted to write a profile of me. And so my office gave him the names of a lot of people to talk to. And after I was confirmed, he came into my office and started handing me these disgusting cards that the Nazis were very bureaucratic, cards with various names from my family and that people that have been sent to concentration camps. It's one thing to find out you're Jewish. It's another thing to find out how many people died. And so I felt obviously that I needed to know more. I couldn't leave and go investigate. So I asked my brother and sister to go, and I learned an awful lot. But in terms of what it made me feel is the following thing. I always knew about the Holocaust. I just didn't know that it was identified with my family. And my parents were dead by the time when all this was coming out. I was trying to figure out why, in fact, they might have not told me about it. And I think it's because we were coming to a new country and they knew that there was nothing that we could do about this and that it was better to find a new life. And it must have been a horrible decision for them. How did it affect me? It affected me in terms of feeling incredibly sorry for them, that they made a very hard decision and they were loving in every single way and protective of everything. Made me understand why they worried every time I was late for something or worried about my children. But mostly my feeling felt terribly sorry for them. My understanding of what had happened and the fact that, and I knew this obviously as a student of history, that there had been people who acted as if they did not know what was happening during World War II. And all of a sudden, we were in office at a time when there was information about everything. And I was dealing with the Balkans and what was going on with ethnic cleansing
Mhm.
in the Balkans, and the pictures that one saw were people in prison clothes being transported to concentration camps. And I thought, I'm in office now. We can't pretend that we don't know about this. So it did affect me personally vis-a-vis my parents, but it didn't change my view of the Holocaust, but it definitely affected my behavior in what I thought was the right thing to do in terms of policy.
You, some years later, came into possession of a diary that your maternal grandma, your mother's mother, had kept, at least for a little bit, of the beginning of 1942. And it's remarkable. It must have been incredibly powerful reading for you to read her anticipation of transports to Theresienstadt, the concentration camp, the restrictions on Jews. What was that like? Here,
Well, stunning. I mean, I have to tell you is my parents lived in Denver. My father died. My mother moved to Washington, D.C. And she brought all these various boxes and things with her, and when she died, they were all in my house. And I knew my father had been working on a book about the Czechoslovak legionnaires in the new Soviet Union after World War I. And my mother kept saying, at some point you have to finish the book. And I couldn't make myself do that. And I just didn't look into these boxes at all. And so then what happened was I become Secretary of State, and the security people come and live in my garage, and they said, we've got to get rid of all these boxes. And so I put them all into one of those storage units. And at a certain point, I thought, I was looking for something, or I need to go there. And I'm plowing through these boxes. And all of a sudden, I find an envelope, and I open it, and in it is this diary. And it was just stunning to me. And I obviously started reading. It's written in Czech, and it is a mixture of things, because it's written to my mother, because by then my parents were in England, and it's a mixture of how a lot of it is about me, how is Madelenka, I bet she's saying cute things, etc. A lot of it is, I'm just trying to keep in touch with you. And then in a very sober way, describing the kinds of things that were going on in terms of Jews not being allowed to go into they were living outside of Prague, into certain places. The fact that they were told they had to give up all their warm clothes so that they could be given to the German military. And in a most descriptive way, she talked about it all. And then also that they were going to be taken away. And so the only way I could describe it in many ways as like a message in a bottle, and the messages that it was sending. And a lot of it is also a spirit of hope that we would all see each other again. And so it's deeply moving. I did translate it. It is published in the book, Hell and Other Destinations. And it really meant an awful lot to find it. I also, 2 or 3 summers ago now, I took my children and grandchildren to Terezin, the concentration camp, where we dedicated a plaque to the 26 members of my family that died in the Holocaust.
There's just one other scene from the book that I want to ask you about, and I want you to talk about. It turns out to be quite an ironic scene. You're describing the kind of messy, open, sincere, maybe a little nutty in some cases, nature of American freedom by describing a location in Washington, D.C. You tell me what you.
Well, I have to tell you, I mean, the book, why I even wrote this particular Hell and Other Destinations, is because I wanted to explain the kinds of things that I've been doing since I left office. And it's got a sentence in there. People ask me how I want to be remembered. I don't want to be remembered. I'm still here. And so I wanted to explain all the things that I was doing, and a lot of things in terms of being around Washington and explaining the atmosphere and various aspects. And I used to, this describes, of all places, Lafayette Square. And I had often gone there even when I was out of office, because I am president of the Truman Foundation and their headquarters are in that block, and or having gone to actually visit people at Blair House. And so I was familiar with that square. Plus, having worked at the White House, I knew what it was like to be able to go in through those gates and have access to the White House when I was working there. And I described Lafayette Square in terms of this incredible place that is in so many ways dedicated to freedom, and the statues that are there of Lafayette and Kosciuszko and a couple of other real people that were helping in terms of making the United States free. And then I was describing the scene there of just lots of different people, and the variety and the noise and the whole kind of sense of people feeling that they could walk up around and look at the White House. And then I can't believe I actually wrote this. And I said, in 10 minutes, it can be closed.
That would be the definition of curtailing freedom, would be shutting down
Lafayette Square.
And it was just a few months later that rather famously protesters were moved out of that space so that the president could raise a Bible in front of
no. And now, by the way, in preparation for whatever they thought would happen after the election, they have put up a very, very high, ugly new fence. And so I never think of myself as being able to predict things, but wow. I mean, I reread that and I thought, how did I even think of this? But it really is and has been a place of freedom and excitement and pleasure and history and memory. And the fact that what Trump did to close it down for a photo op that was inappropriate.
Well, Secretary Albright, given your work in the 21st century with the National Democratic Institute, writing books, busy working with our NATO allies and concerning yourself with the advancement of democracy, doing a little bit of farming at the same time up out near Washington. Have you considered retirement?
No. For me, I have to say retirement is kind of a four-letter word. And it goes back to something you asked, what was it like when I first left college? And I have always been 10 years older than everybody because it took me a long time to be able to do the kinds of things that I was interested in. And I really do like what I do. And I am finding that having to be, I'm sitting in my house in Washington where I haven't really gone out very much. I've walked around my garden or driven out to my farm to kind of see the cows walk back and forth. But I like what I do and I learn from it. And every one of the things I do, I wrote the book in order to explain how they all fit together. And so I am teaching. I was just earlier this afternoon pulling together things for my class. I learn a lot from my students. I like the various aspects. I love doing the democracy work. And I have a business and I keep very busy. My only problem is that I am a total extrovert. I'm trying to learn to be an introvert and I'm not doing very well. And as much as I've gotten used to Zoom, you don't get the same buzz out of it as if you are with people. And so I welcome the opportunity to talk to you and answer questions, but I wish it were in person. Yes. And I wish I could be and get my award in person because I'm so deeply, deeply honored by the idea of it and its real basis of it and what it means. So I'm delighted to have a chance to talk.
Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, thank you very much for being a virtual extrovert with us today, and thanks for joining us, and congratulations on the honor.
Thank you for your kindness and your good questions. Thank you.